men and their fighting skills was based almost solely on their race and not on, there was no kind of understanding given that these men had literally just been mustered into the Union Army like 4 or 5 days before. And no one who was here, and not even the Army regulars who were serving before in frontier garrisons, had ever been in this kind of engagement before. No one had ever fought in this kind of battle, even though, it was kind of roughly 3,500, 3,800 maybe on the Union side and about 3,000 on the Confederate side, which, seems like incredibly small numbers when you compare it to the Eastern Theater. But no one had ever fought in a battle with that many people in that way before in their lives. But there was this kind of racialized criticism in this specific context because of the multiracial nature of the first New Mexico.
Right. And if there's any war that's all about giving a gun to someone who has absolutely no experience, it's a Civil War. Or give an officer a commission who was before an Episcopalian bishop or a professor of philosophy.
Right.
It's happening all over the place.
Right. Yes.
Well, when I was reading the blurb of this book, it mentioned this multiracial aspect. And the first thing that pops into my mind was the assumption that, maybe American Indians were somehow involved. And because I don't know why my mind was going to the French-Indian War, where they're heavily involved on the British side and the French side. And that's a completely different time and place, but that's where my mind went. But then later on, you mentioned that the aims for both the Union and the Confederacy are the defeat and removal of natives from their homelands. And for the Union side, they have this belief as they are working for the emancipation of slaves in the East. So what's happening here? Why are they both set on this goal of the war?
Sure, yeah. So, how I mentioned before this kind of Confederate vision of the empire of slavery. Well, that did not include Native people. This whole idea, this whole vision rests on Southerners' ability to conquer the Southwest, take these lands, convert them into plantations, and work them with enslaved men and women. And that vision did not include Native peoples at all. And so what we see on the Confederate side, the first move is actually made by one of these guys who we were just talking about, who was a lawyer and a politician and a rancher in Texas, this guy named John Baylor. Readers of the Three-Cornered War will meet him in the first chapter of the book, and he's kind of he's the vanguard of Confederate Manifest Destiny. He is the one who brings the first group of kind of 300 mounted Texas volunteers and brings them across the line into New Mexico territory. And he forces the surrender of Fort Fillmore and occupies the town of Mesilla, and then he is the one who creates, just solely on his own authority, the Confederate territory of Arizona, and lays out its boundaries a little differently than the Arizona we know today, kind of stopping at the 34th parallel, about halfway up New Mexico, and then extending all the way to the Colorado River, to the California border. And Baylor had a history of Indian fighting. He had gone out several times in the past to attack Comanche settlements and to murder men and women. And he was actually wearing, when he rode into Mesilla, a belt buckle with the CSA stamped on it that was made out of melted silver that he took off the body of a Comanche man he killed. So part of his kind of leadership quality and part of his argument for being an officer was that he was this great Indian fighter. And so after he established himself, he really turned his attention, particularly to the Chiricahua Apaches, whose homelands are kind of right west of the Rio Grande and extend all the way to Tucson. And they were going to be a problem for the Confederacy, right, for expanding all the way to California, because they were going to have to move through Apacheria, and the Chiricahua Apaches were going to not have any truck with that. They were going to resist that because this was, an affront to their sovereignty and directly challenged them and their ownership of this territory. And so Baylor did a couple of things. One, he launched his own invasion into Mexico, which almost created this international incident. Purportedly in pursuit of Apaches. He murdered several Apaches in the town of Corralitos, right about the time that the rest of the Confederate Army was fighting and moving on from Valverde. And then he also, right before he left the West, he signed what was called the Apache Extermination Order in March of 1862, where he basically gave local militias permission to lure Apaches into peace parleys using whiskey, he said. And once they did that, then the militias had the right to, and that they were ordered to, kill all of the men and then enslave the women and the children. So this was part of his plan, at least. I don't think that most Confederates really thought about enslaving Native peoples, although there was a very long history of that form of enslavement of both Hispanos and Native peoples in the Southwest. I think they still had a vision of black slavery being kind of transplanted into the West. But this was part of the plan. They really did see that in order for their vision to be accomplished in the West, that they were going to have to exterminate or remove or possibly enslave Native peoples. So that was the Confederate vision. And then the Union vision, the 1860 Republican platform said that the natural state of the territories, the Western territories, is freedom, right? And this is usually seen as an anti-slavery assertion, and it is, but it's also an anti-Native assertion, because part of what is required to kind of create this nation of white, this is how they were saying it then, white free farmers and laborers and miners and business people, part of what was required was the extermination or removal of Indigenous peoples across the region. And so the Union was very interested in making that happen, either politically or militarily or both. The first thing they had to do was retain control of the region, though, in their fight against the Confederates. And so the Union Army didn't really put that plan, and the Republican Congress didn't put that plan in motion for the Union really until after the Confederates had been defeated and had retreated back to Texas in the spring and summer of 1862.
I think this gets to the big question you're addressing in the book is, why did things end up the way that they did with Native peoples and the U.S. government? And I'd really love you to dive into this and bring the Civil War into it. But what I'm thinking about this question is, it didn't have to turn out this way, or there's a good reason to think it didn't. I recently wrapped up a series on the Revolutionary War with a host, and we talk about what ifs of what if the United States had remained part of the British Empire. Mm-hmm. And some argue that relations would have been much better with Native peoples, as in the case of Canada, where as Western expansion takes place, the government security goes out ahead of settlers, so there's not a Wild West in the same way. Lands are given to the Native peoples where they're already living, so there's not a trail of tears in the same situation. So all that to say, many argue it could have been more peaceful like Canada. So I wonder, how do you look at things? Why was there this conflict and this push for removal? Was it something that was organic, that more or less happened as it couldn't really have happened any other way? Was there population densities that there was in Canada, so there was more conflict and friction? Was it an ideological project? And so that's my big question. Why? And how did the Civil War kick all this off?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And I think it's, as with anything in history, it is complicated and probably a combination of all of those things that you mentioned. Because from the very first moment that Europeans set foot in North America, their engagement with Native peoples was about removal and land taking. Right? They wanted to shove them off because, of course, Native peoples were tending to the land and hunting and fishing and planting on really good land. And so that first kind of statement is made by either just taking it outright and fencing it in, or establishing a kind of treaty relationship and securing a kind of sale of homelands, right? But what that means is that necessarily requires removal. And that whole kind of tradition of white engagement with Indigenous peoples across the United States, it was very uneven, obviously. I think it's important to recognize the diversity of various engagements between European newcomers and Indigenous peoples over time. I mean, we never want to say that the history of this is all about conflict or all about alliance or all about decimation or all about survival. It's all of those things at different moments, at different inflection points. But I think the really important moment for shaping everything that came after was 1830 and the Indian Removal Act. Because what that did is it's kind of solidified this idea of removal as an absolutely requisite kind of component of Indian policy that the government was going to take up from this point forward. That they would either meet with Native peoples and hammer out a treaty that provided for their removal, or they would make war upon them and force their removal. And leading up, and reservations became part of that increasingly in the 1840s and 50s. And again, this is where we get the kind of blank. Most histories of U.S. Indian policy sort of leap over the Civil War. Like we go from, Indian conflicts with the U.S. government in the 1840s and 50s, and we leap over that and go straight to the Plains Wars and the Indian Wars of the 1870s. Right? It's like the Civil War didn't even happen.
Yeah, and then Wounded Knee, and then that's it.
Yeah. So, but my contention in the Three-Cornered War is that the Civil War is actually a very important moment in this whole evolution of Indian policy. And in the Southwest, it's really James Carleton who has brought this, 2,000-person army from California and is too late to get at the Confederates. They're already back in Texas by the time he arrives. But he takes over the Department of New Mexico, and he's the one who's really articulating the Lincoln administration's and the Republican Party's kind of view here in the Union War Department, where he just basically says, there will be no more treaties. We're not going to make any treaties. What we're going to do is wage a series of hard war campaigns against Indigenous peoples in this region in order to force their surrender. Then we will remove them to reservations to get them into a space where we can, that first of all, no white people want to be, right? Because part of the point was that Chiricahuas, Apaches, and Navajos in particular were in the way, that their lands were in the way, and that their lands were potentially quite valuable for future white settlers. So you had to remove them to a place where they would be out of the way. They would not be tempted to attack migrants, white migrants coming from the east into the west during the war and after, and where they could be monitored and surveilled. And then, Carleton's vision, and he was pretty deeply Christian, and he believed in the part of Indian policy which promoted native civilization, where they would be sort of civilized and then possibly assimilated into American life, possibly as citizens, if they converted to Christianity, if they became farmers, if they kind of basically abandoned all of their indigenous culture. So a kind of form of cultural extermination. So this was the policy that Carleton put in place in New Mexico in the fall of 1863, and it really ramped up in the winter of 1864. And the whole kind of last third of the book is really focused on these Union campaigns, which expressed this evolution in Union Indian policy, and was able to enact it because of Civil War mobilization, right? I mean, there had never been this many soldiers in the Southwest before. Like there were thousands of them where there had been hundreds before. And so Carleton was able, with War Department funding and with, this 3 years